Okay, guys, we're back. Um, so anyhow, I don't want to get too involved in the storyline, um, and I made some notes while I was watching that movie, um, so that I could share with you. So again, going back, this might be a good example in terms of um, if I had worked on a task force, for example, and whether or not that task force was successful. Obviously, this task force with the Unabomber had been in existence for several years, and as I mentioned earlier, they still had settled for the original profile and did not want to change that profile. And so we talked a bit about unlearning. Um, some of the other concepts I quickly pulled out of my hat as I was watching this was the whole idea, excuse me, of communities of practice might be applicable here. Um, this small sub-task force that Agent Fitzgerald was involved in, remember, he's the guy that actually made the case through linguistics. Um, he and a couple of other colleagues, some of them were profilers, some of them were just regular field agents. Um, and their goal obviously was to try to better interpret the Unabomber letters. And then for those of you who recall, the Unabomber had written a manifesto. And ultimately, the U.S. government decided to allow the manifesto to be printed. It's what Kaczynski wanted anyhow. And as a result of that, some leads came in that Fitzgerald was able to determine who the likely Unabomber was, and that was Ted Kaczynski. But the communities of practice, I think, tied into this. Maybe even to some extent cross-community boundaries, because we were dealing with people in the task force who, although they worked for the FBI, some of them never knew each other. They never worked with each other before. So there was always that level of trust that comes into play anytime a new person comes on board, regardless of who that new person is. Obviously, we talked about the trust associated with competency, and then there's that trust that comes with being part of a group. And obviously, the more trust we have, the more likely we are to share our knowledge and share our ideas. And so you saw a lot of that in this particular movie about the Unabomber, because this small group really began to be very creative in terms of analyzing the words that Kaczynski used, as well as the format of the words and the type of language that he elected to use. And so that all sort of came together as part of this movie. So I was able to glean some of that from there. The communities of practice. We talked about sharing and hoarding, and those two concepts as they relate to knowledge management in terms of the public good. Obviously, the wanting to change the profile might be applicable to some extent here in this particular movie that I was watching. But I think when you go through the movie, you realize that the Agent Fitzgerald also kept some things to himself, especially towards the end, where he was beginning to get close to identifying who the Unabomber was. He wasn't sharing as much of that information with the task force. At that time, he had been taken off the task force for reasons that aren't really important here, but he was removed from the task force, but he still did not share that information with others until he was pretty certain as to who the Unabomber was. We talked about the whole idea of unlearning. I mentioned that earlier. Distortion in communication, and I think that comes into play merely by the fact that the organization, the FBI organization, the management, wasn't inclined to recognize failure, wasn't inclined to recognize failure associated with the profile. And obviously, I think a lot of that might have stifled some creativity, because it was clear that the profile wasn't going to change from what they developed 10 years ago. and the FBI was still investigating people that clearly had nothing to do with the Unabomber, but they felt met the old profile. There was a certain level of power and politics involved, and this becomes more evident at the end. So remember, we talked about power and knowledge last week, and whether or not knowledge is power, and that level of trust. Okay, we talked about trust, and some of that has to do with power and politics as well. Because what had happened is once the Unabomber was arrested, once Ted Kaczynski was arrested, Agent Fitzgerald thought for sure that he was going to get some kudos. He thought that the supervising agent in charge, who took up most of the limelight, he believed that he was probably going to go to mention his name, at least some recognition for his work and effort in this new field of linguistic forensics. But his name was never mentioned. He never came up. Just the bosses spoke, and probably credited a lot with their leadership and the task force. But Agent Fitzgerald didn't get the recognition that I think that he thought he should have gotten. And so that might go back to some level of trust. So you can think about that in terms of what will happen next time in terms of his level of trust with upper management as he is helping with some type of specialized case such as Unabomber. At the end, however, when Ted Kaczynski was in prison, the only person that Ted Kaczynski wanted to talk to was the person that caught him, as he said, and that was Agent Fitzgerald. And so now you can imagine that Agent Fitzgerald is the one that had all the power because he in fact had the knowledge. He had what it took to interview Ted Kaczynski, and he was ultimately able to convince Ted Kaczynski that instead of going to trial, he should plead guilty. There were a lot of reasons behind that, but you can see how that power and knowledge shifts from one player to another as a result of this in this movie, but more specifically in terms of the task force. Okay, so I tried to explain this in the context of a movie, but the movie again was about the task force, the dynamics that was occurring within the task force, which I thought served as a good example for what we've been learning about in terms of knowledge management in organizations. So, if I were writing a paper and it had to do with this particular task force, what I would probably do first is try to recognize some of the key concepts involved. And I talked about lack of trust, knowledge-related differences, communities of practices, the whole idea of sharing and hoarding, distortion in communications, the power of politics and conflict that was involved in this whole process. Once you learn and identify some key concepts that you think fit your paper and your topic, then what I would probably do is go back to that chapter, which we talk about those concepts and principles, and then look at what theories that the authors describe that might be applicable to your specific research and your specific topic for this paper. And then you have your theories that you can tie. So you're not only tying in theories, you're tying in concepts. And again, you really should try to at least identify 3, and that really shouldn't be a problem. But that might be a way to start. I don't want to tell you how to write your paper. I'm just saying that I would probably start with simple concepts and say, well, this is a pretty good example of unlearning, and then maybe go back and look at that chapter which covers unlearning, and then it reevaluates some of those theories and other concepts that I might be able to squeeze into that particular section of my paper. All right. Try not to make this assignment any harder than it is. Not intended to be hard. Again, you may have to think about an event or something that occurred that is going to allow you to use that as your springboard, so to speak, in terms of something that might have happened in a place that you work, organization, or something that you might be familiar with in terms of some actual event that occurred. Again, I just happened to be watching this movie on Netflix, and I thought, wow, it really ties into what we're talking about because it was a task force situation. and a lot of the dynamics and knowledge management came out in this movie. So hopefully this helped a little bit, and I didn't want to confuse you, so hopefully I didn't do that. So you got some readings this week, which I know you're probably more focused on the paper, and I think our paper is the only thing due this week, but please try to read the readings for the chapter when time permits this week. Other than that, if you have any questions about this, or for whatever reason you hit a stone wall, don't hesitate to give me a holler. You can most certainly call or text me if you want. Obviously you can email, but if it's something you want to talk about right away or get resolved quickly, then it's easy just to call or text me. Okay. Anyhow, you guys have a blessed week, and I really look forward to reading your papers this week and next week. All right. Thanks. I'll talk to you later. Bye.